A little up close and personal. I know. I know. Allow me to explain. I have had quite a long few months. And by long, I mean miserable. Personally, politically, emotionally, psychologically, it's been a rough time. You know, sometimes when you have a really a prolonged period of just like kind of going through it, and then the feeling that follows the period of time that follows is like it's like a proportional rush of serotonin. I feel that I'm entering that phase now, and like I just feel happy, and I feel happy to not be quite so miserable. The sun is out and it's getting a little warmer, and I just like spent all morning listening to Beyonce's new album, and I took a walk for 2 hours. And anyway, I like knew I was going to sit down to record this, and I was like, I want to sit in front of the window. Like, I'm not putting up the lights. I just want to look out into the sun while we record this. And so here we are. And hello, Patreon, and welcome back. And thank you so much for being here. And I love you. And I feel jubilant. Now, I know that you did not sign up for my Patreon thinking that I would talk to you about boobs, but here we are. Life is like a box of chocolates. So here we go. A few weeks ago, Sydney Sweeney hosted SNL, and a lot of conservatives learned for the first time who she was because they never watched Euphoria. And she looked really hot. She's Sydney Sweeney. Conservative media was not normal about this. I think we're witnessing something really interesting lately that you can especially see on the cultural right, where everything that happens in popular media is like shoved into the culture war vacuum, and the amount of mental gymnastics that has to be done in order for any of that to happen is just like increasingly wild to witness, right? And so, for example, like this bridge in Baltimore just collapsed because a ship collided with it. And then for some reason, every like right-wing cultural commentator on Twitter was talking about how this was the consequence of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. There's some racist narrative going on in there somewhere, but honestly, a lot of these people have gotten so far down the rabbit hole of like conspiratorial racism that I actually don't even know what they mean anymore when they make racist comment. Like, it's like Russian nesting dolls of racism, and I need someone to like uncup like the first 3 of them for me so I can even understand what is going on. And I say that as someone who spends like 12 hours a day online. If that's the situation for me, what does that leave for normal people with jobs? And so in another, kind of classic example of this, Sydney Sweeney hosts SNL. She looks great. And immediately her boobs are like squeezed into the culture war machine and like deified by the right. On a tweet with 62 million impressions, Richard Hananiah tweets, "Wokeness is dead," and it's a video of Sydney Sweeney closing out the SNL show. Inez Stepman on Twitter writes, "Men don't only like Sydney Sweeney for her boobs. They also like her because she's the first starlet in a long time to unrepentantly and cheerfully chase the male gaze. She is clearly giving permission to ogle and enjoying that feminine power. An oasis for men in a nut vice culture, LOL." What the fuck is going on here? A shocking number of people reacting in these like bizarrely political ways to Sydney Sweeney having boobs on SNL were other women, which I thought was interesting and sad, and also just a reminder that like women can uphold these ridiculous structures as much as men can. Bridget Fatesi for The Spectator wrote, quote, "For anyone under the age of 25, they've likely never seen it in their lifetime, as the giggling blonde with an amazing rack has been stamped out of existence, a creature shamed to the brink of extinction." My personal belief is that Sydney Sweeney should be allowed to kill people. Amy Hamm for the National Post writes, "Wokeness is no match for Sydney Sweeney's undeniable beauty. We've been pressured into pretending everyone is beautiful except for those who actually are." And so I want to start with this article by Amy Hamm, which she opens by bravely asking the very normal question that a very normal person would think to ask when they see a beautiful woman. Are Sydney Sweeney's breasts double D harbingers of the death of woke? She continues, "We've spent years being chastised for desiring or admiring beauty, because beauty is rare and exclusionary, and to exclude is to hate. Or so we've been scolded to accept by today's diversity, equity, and inclusion fanatics." Ooh, DEI mention. Tally that down, everybody. "We aren't supposed to admire Sweeney's beauty, but we've done it anyways. The times, they are a-changin', aren't they?" Okay, pause. Has anyone I mean, anyone. Like, can anyone give me a single example of someone being punished for admiring the beauty of a blonde, busty, thin white woman? Is this a thing that's happening? Maybe I just don't know. Is this a thing that's happening? Amy Ham seems to think so. She continues, recall the words of unrepentant thought criminal Jordan Peterson on the plus-sized model that graced the cover of Sports Illustrated 2 years back. He wrote, sorry, not beautiful. And no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that. To this day, the man is partly facing censure from his professional regulator over these words. I am so interested in this phenomenon of people thinking that they are badass revolutionaries, unrepentant thought criminals, while literally fighting to uphold the most mainstream, normalized, already completely acceptable vision of society, right? I'm a thought criminal for thinking that Sydney Sweeney is hot. Outlaw me, boys. What world do you live in? The wokes are gonna send me to jail for looking at Sydney Sweeney's tits. My husband said that Kate Upton was beautiful and he was taken away by the woke police. There was this really amazing Tumblr post from a long time ago that I think about whenever I read like hot takes like this from people like Amy Ham. Love when people become so online in spaces like this where marginalized people are actually the ones dominating the conversations that they forget what it's like in the real world and start making positivity posts for things that are literally 100% unchallenged and normalized in real life. Let men be masculine. I want to return to her talking about Jordan Peterson for a second. If you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, first of all, I want what you have and I'm jealous. He's kind of like the incel king, you know? He's an author and like a doctor and he promotes these like whack job diets and he's one of these people who I guess builds a brand around being like a rational, normal guy just like seeking the truth. And then that ultimately just like makes him like an anti-trans right-wing incel edgelord. I want to revisit this claim that Amy Ham is making about Jordan Peterson, which is that he supposedly advocated for the beauty of people like Sydney Sweeney or something, and that he's still facing professional consequences as a result. So the context here is for the 2022 Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, this model called Yumi Nu is on the cover. And first and foremost, she's really hot. I don't know. She's giving sex. Like she's giving sex appeal. She's absolutely gorgeous. She's not stick thin, right? And I think in the modeling and like swimsuit modeling world, she'd be considered plus size. And she looks really good. She's wearing a strappy black bathing suit that shows off her hips and her cleavage. She's like serving cunt in the face and she looks really fucking good. Anyway, so Jordan Peterson posts a picture of this swimsuit cover on Twitter and he writes, sorry, not beautiful, and no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that. Amy Ham's whole point of bringing up Jordan Peterson and this incident in her article is to say that thought criminal Jordan Peterson was sentenced to the guillotine for, quote, desiring or admiring beauty. But that's not what he did. He didn't point to Sydney Sweeney or some other woman he found attractive and went, wow, she's so hot. He pointed to this woman on the cover of Sports Illustrated who he is not attracted to and called her ugly. That's different. In short, he was an asshole. But even still, did he actually face any professional consequences as Amy Ham claims? I don't think so. In fact, I imagine he was rewarded by it because his whole career is based off of being an asshole in as public of a way as possible. Jordan Peterson continues 2 years later to have one of the most popular podcasts in the world and is worth millions of dollars. If he was really a thought criminal, wouldn't he be facing consequences? Isn't that the insinuation of calling him a thought criminal? I don't know. Maybe he's just like robbing the bank and really getting away with it. He's a smooth thought criminal. Back to Amy Ham. We've all been pressured into pretending that we are bad people if we aren't attracted to every influencer wannabe who is unattractive by any reasonable standard of beauty. It is the adult equivalent of handing out prize ribbons to every kid on sports day. Even to the kid that face planted in a mud puddle and couldn't finish a potato sack race. Everyone wins and everyone must be regarded as beautiful. Except, of course, the people who actually are. People want to look at beauty on TV and in art generally, but we're being starved of it because attractiveness is deemed immoral. As such, beauty is now political. For this, we can thank the tyrannical, woke, and ironically minority vanguard that has for years coerced our culture into pretending that unbeautiful things are beautiful. Is Amy Ham living on an entirely different planet from me? We're being starved of conventional attractiveness in mainstream art. Margot Robbie, Sydney Sweeney, Zendaya. Well, I guess it's true that Zendaya might be too quote unquote woke for these people because woke does mean black. Because what these people are actually aspiring to return to but can't say outright, so they use a lot of coded language, is like a standard of beauty popularly upheld in, I don't know, Nazi Germany. Beauty is now political. Everyone wants to be a revolutionary, you know? Everyone wants to be subversive. Everyone wants to fight what they consider to be injustice. Everyone wants to be a warrior in the fight for a just world. And I think that desire to fight for a just world, it taps into this profound need that we all have for purpose, which is one that I understand. I mean, insofar as it relates to me being queer, I mean, there are so many struggles and challenges with being queer, right? On a personal level, we all want to overcome our childhood trauma. We want to fight for our relationships and our bodies to not only be tolerated, but accepted and recognized in public. There's so much fighting for your place in the world that comes with being queer. And while that's challenging, it also gives you a purpose. And I think a lot of people who belong to various minority groups feel this, which is that you also are then able to create community with other people who are sharing your quest for liberation. And so I understand this desire for a cause, for a fight, and I don't think it's a bad one. In fact, I think it's a good one. But time and time again, I see people, mainly white conservatives, just totally lose the plot in trying to find a cause to get behind, you know? White men are under attack. Let men be masculine. Let us acknowledge Sydney Sweeney's beauty without being chained up for it. It's like, what? You are arguing with the wall. This stuff is already the norm. Back to Amy. And hey, if the Sweeney discourse isn't buttoned up to the neck quickly enough, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of an SNL staff walkout or a sermonic diatribe by an upcoming host over the inherent harm and violence of Eurocentric beauty standards. Vanity Fair has already published a think piece on how SNL did her dirty by enabling the audience to merely observe her youth and beauty. Bastards. Maybe SNL will even haul Sydney back onto the stage for a dressing down over her brazen display. Maybe Sweeney will resent feeling she's been used as a pawn in a raging culture war she never intended to take a side in, and end up announcing a Biden 2024 endorsement. But none of these possibilities will change the fact that we are all starting to envisage the death of woke. We're seeing it everywhere, including in the breasts of young, beautiful women. But that's besides the point, because with Sweeney, what it really comes down to is this: sex sells, and that has never changed. Okay, I think Amy Ham and basically everyone contributing to the Sydney Sweeney's woke boobs discourse is entirely out of their fucking minds. But ready for a little nuance? I do think this article raises at least one interesting point about the limitations of the body positivity movement in the 2010s, which is something that fat activists like Aubrey Gordon of the Maintenance Phase podcast have been talking about for a while. A lot of body positivity marketing ultimately came down to, we should be nicer to people who are fat. You know, we need to change the way we talk to and about different body types. We shouldn't be mean anymore. But what was less often tapped into in a meaningful way was, how do we feel about fat people? What misconceptions are we still holding on to about, say, fat people's bodies and correlations between their size and their health? Misconceptions and prejudices that fundamentally haven't changed, but that we just won't talk about now because we want to be nice. I think part of what Amy Ham is tapping into here, in the most ridiculous and fucking annoying way possible, is a frustration with having to be nice to people she doesn't find attractive. Whether it's because they're fat or non-white or non-normative in their gender presentation, she doesn't want to have to pretend the norms have changed when they actually haven't. And interestingly, as a visibly queer and sometimes gender non-conforming person, I agree with her. It's a frustration that I've seen shared by many fat activists and queer activists and black activists. Nobody in any marginalized community wants to be put on a magazine cover because you feel badly for them, right? I don't want a pity photo shoot. I don't want to be a metric in a cheap diversity quota. I don't want you to be nice to me because you feel badly for me. Thought criminal Amy Ham and I are in agreement. No more being nice as a means of playing pretend. The difference between Amy Ham and I is that she thinks that this frustration is evidence that nothing can be done about the status quo of beauty, that it can never change, and that any notion that it can is foolish, and any attempt at changing whose bodies are allowed to be on screen for the masses is delusional, and that we should all let Sydney Sweeney step on our throats forever, yes, God. Whereas I think this means we should have more meaningful conversations about what we find beautiful and why, what we find palatable for audiences and why. Like, I agree that diversity casting is hollow and that, those Dove commercials from 10 years ago didn't create all that much meaningful change to beauty norms anywhere beyond marketing executive meetings in glass conference rooms. So where do we go from here? How do we have meaningful conversations about body and gender and style diversity that go beyond, love yourself, you poor little minority piece of shit, you're beautiful? The plus-size blogger Natalie Craig wrote an interesting essay for Cosmopolitan a few months ago called My Fat Liberation is Not a Trend, where she wrote about her grievances with the body-positive Instagram marketing era being just that, a blip on the radar in an ever-evolving social media discourse of which bodies are cool and profitable that, at the end of the day, yielded very little meaningful change. Quote, "It's not like the unrealistic beauty belief of nothing tastes as good as being skinny feels ever truly left, or that we achieve true, full liberation. We live in the era of face-tuning after all. But at least there was a blissful, albeit brief moment where people didn't say their most toxic, fat-phobic thoughts out loud. It's starting to become increasingly apparent how many people and brands were simply using body positivity and curve washing as zeitgeisty marketing ploys. If it's any indication of what's to come, many influencers who previously used body positivity to build a career and land brand deals are coming right out and telling us how they really feel. Over the last few months, I've seen some of my fellow fat content creators getting weight loss surgery or clamoring for the newly FDA-approved weight loss drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro. It's painful to see people carelessly abandoning the body positivity and fat liberation movements that they built communities on, diminishing the change we've worked so hard to catalyze. On the heels of this shift, I've noticed more hate comments on my own content than ever before. Whether I'm putting an outfit together, making pizza with my boyfriend, or working out, men and women feel entitled to let me know that I should lose weight, stop promoting obesity, and even die, all because I'm fat. Were our bodies and the fact that we refused to hate them just a passing fad, only as valuable as long as they were profitable? And I think whether you identify as fat or being part of the fat community or the fat liberation movement, or are part of any number of other minoritized groups like the queer community, like the Black community, these are sentiments that sound and feel really viscerally familiar. I mean, think about all the brands who cashed in on pro-Black sentiments in the summer of 2020. And obviously, all of these brands who took part in pride campaigns over the last 10 years, only to abandon these movements entirely when they went out of fashion or became unprofitable, never to yield any meaningful, lasting material change. All of this crystallizes into something that I think a lot about, which is how much of the mainstream quote-unquote progress we've achieved in the last 15 years or so on issues like body positivity and LGBTQ equality and racial justice is about what we're allowed to say. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely think that it should be considered socially unacceptable to be an asshole to marginalized people. Saying slurs is bad, and you shouldn't be able to just call gay people faggots on the streets, unless of course, you're also a faggot and it's said with that kind of intra-community sisterly love, but that's a different thing. What I mean though is, it's one thing to socially uphold this belief that we should all be nicer to each other, regardless of sexuality or gender or race or religion or appearance or what have you. It's not a bad thing. I agree that we should all be nice to each other. But people feeling like they should be nice and not say mean things is not necessarily the same as fostering actual deep understanding of why prejudice is wrong. And it's certainly, by the way, not the same as legislation that actually protects marginalized people. Shallow acceptance or tolerance can be undone just as easily as it came to be, which is, I think, part of what we're seeing with the rapid erosion of LGBTQ rights in this country. Like, I think for the most part, the people who are now being openly and happily transphobic and homophobic on Facebook and on Twitter and in the government have felt this way the entire time. But for a brief period of Obama era love is love bliss, it just wasn't cool to express that bigotry. But in many ways, the social acceptance that came around during that period was really shallow, which is, by the way, something that a lot of queer people who aren't cis and white could have probably told you they knew the entire time, because the love is love marriage equality era of LGBTQ social progress was really only ever for a very specific type of queer person. I tend to refer to this person as the Pete Buttigieg archetype. No shade to Pete Buttigieg. It's just that was who that stuff was for. It wasn't for Black trans people. It wasn't really for trans people at all. It wasn't for gender nonconforming and non-binary people. It wasn't for sex workers. It wasn't for HIV positive people. It was for cis, gay, upper middle class white men who could, if they needed to at any point, most easily assimilate into straight culture. Pete Buttigieg. You know, I've met Chasten, Pete's husband. I've met him. Total doll. I went to like he released a book and I went to the book party. Really, really lovely guy. This isn't shade, but privilege is privilege. Anyway, so, you know, now that anti-queer bigotry is once again a viable political tool on the right, which it also had been for decades before the aforementioned Obama era, it's back in full force. Because in many ways, it never left. It just took a break for the sake of politeness. And that is the risk of, to use the words of ContraPoints, shallow acceptance based on shallow understanding. I think a really great and more acute example of what I'm talking about is like, if you're a member of a marginalized group, right? Maybe you're queer, maybe you're a person of color, maybe you're disabled, maybe you're a religious minority or fat or a sex worker. Self-identified liberals will often take on the aesthetic of being warm and accepting until you disagree with them on something. And then the true feelings come out. And so I want to use a personal example for a second, because as you know, I have taken a stance against Israel and the atrocities that Israel is committing. And I knew that that would alienate some people who already followed me. And of course it did. What I didn't know was just how wild some of the things that I received would be. So there was this person who followed me, and, you know, every now and then I like go into my DMs and I read what people send and for Manifest Mondays and whatnot. And so this person followed me, and, you know, like in March of 2022, they responded to a story of mine saying slay. And then, you know, they made a joke about like gay dads to me a little later in 2022. And they just seemed to like follow me and, you know, like me. A couple months ago, this person sent me a new message. You're such a sick piece of shit. You're precisely the type of Jew who would tell on other Jews during the Holocaust, you disgusting twink Nazi. Your ancestors would spit at you for quite literally promoting anti-Semitic terrorism propaganda. Burn in hell, you disgusting ladyboy freak. Even reading that back, like, I'm not emotional about it because, I don't know, I have such a wall built up against this stuff, but the political implication of it gives me chills. This is an ostensibly liberal person who was like, liked my content for years. And then I said something that they disagree with, and they immediately call me a twink Nazi and a ladyboy freak, just reverting to homophobia with the snap of a finger. And I find a lot of times liberals behave that way. Again, just as far as body positivity is concerned, maybe you're fat, and when you finally say something that a liberal finds disagreeable, they call you some, you know, body shaming slur. Or you're a person of color, and the second that you say something that a liberal disagrees with, they drop the facade of being anti-racist and come after you in a way that is very obviously racist. And so, I don't know, when I received these messages, I was just like, a lot of people just like, you know, quietly dropped off because they disagreed with my stance, and, you know, whatever, that's fine. But calling me a ladyboy freak from someone who had followed me for years was so jarring, and still is. I mean, I would like to think that I foster an audience of people who would never say something like that, no matter how much they disagreed with me on a specific issue. But I guess at a certain point, you don't really have control over it. Anyway. A lot of people seem to be genuinely terrified that the version of beauty that Sydney Sweeney represents is being rapidly eroded and replaced by blue-haired social justice warrior, pronoun woke, gay, trans, non-binary, femboy. I went on Facebook about a month ago, which was my first mistake, and I came across this meme. It was at the top of my feed because, of course, it's fucking Facebook. And so the meme is two pictures side by side. They're two different Calvin Klein advertisements side by side. On the left, it's a Calvin Klein ad from 1993 featuring Marky Mark. And on the right, it's a Calvin Klein ad. It says it's from 2023, but I actually think this was from Pride of 2022, which features a black trans man. And so obviously, the way that you're meant to read this is like, wow, in the 90s, Calvin Klein was showing Marky Mark and people with abs and hot, sexy, thin, straight people. And that was what was considered beautiful. Whereas now in the 2020s, Calvin Klein is only showing fat people and trans people and black people and queer people. And this is who we have to find sexy in underwear now. And it's the authoritarian woke regime telling me what I can find beautiful. Mind you, literally the face of the Calvin Klein Pride campaign, the Pride campaign last year was Twink of the Year Brandon Flynn, who has like bigger biceps and better abs than Marky Mark. So this meme had almost 300,000 likes on Facebook and over 15,000 comments from people talking about what happened to Calvin Klein using hot people. I looked at this and I was like, okay, I'm curious, I'll bite. Who are the models that Calvin Klein is regularly using now? Because this was like a specific Pride campaign they're referencing, but I want to know, has there actually been a radical shift in the models that Calvin Klein is using to sell underwear? And so I went on their website and I scrolled around. What do you think I found? Everyone is thin and cis and toned and normative in their gender expression. Hoorah! Despite the outrage over a single photograph of a trans person wearing Calvin Klein underwear, the beauty standard over at Calvin Klein is still very much exactly what it has been the entire time. No need to worry. Calvin Klein has not gone fully woke yet. What's also interesting about the Calvin Klein example is that wasn't Calvin Klein like famously using children in like disgustingly provocative ways in the 80s to sell jeans? I think it was Brooke Shields, right? Who was like 15 years old and they had her do this ad where she was like, what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing.
You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing.
Calvin Klein jeans.
She was 15. Protect the children, right? No, Calvin Klein has not gone woke. And neither did Bud Light, by the way. You might recall the extent of Bud Light's partnership with Dylan Mulvaney was a single sponsored Instagram video and one physical can of beer that was only ever sent to her. But you might remember it differently because of the way that it was blown out of proportion by these right-wing media people. You'd think every Bud Light in every store everywhere had Dylan's face on it, and that was just never the case. None of these corporations have gone woke, and neither has the mainstream beauty standard, by the way. Sydney Sweeney, you and your perfect boobs are safe. For now. This entire phenomenon of fear-mongering about the tiniest slivers of diversity in mainstream marketing and Hollywood casting is encapsulated really well by this meme. So there are 3 rows, and in each of the rows, there's about 10 stick figures. In the first row, all of the stick figures are white, and it's labeled All Is Well. In the second row, all of them are white, and 1 is black, and it's labeled Forced Diversity. And in the third row, all of them are white, except 2 are black, and it's labeled White Genocide. And that's basically the whole thing, right? Everyone in mainstream media is still cis. The vast majority are still white and thin and cis heteronormative presenting. But then we have like one Sports Illustrated magazine with an arguably fat woman on the cover, or we have like, I don't know, one trans actor in like something, and people are like, are cis people being wiped off of the face of the earth? Is Sydney Sweeney's beauty marginalized? Are white people oppressed? And it's like, no. Last year, Charlie Kirk, the brilliant thought criminal who created Turning Point USA, he tweeted, "What happened to white actors in commercials? They've completely disappeared unless they're portraying ridiculous caricatures of whiteness or incompetence." And my personal belief is that Charlie Kirk doesn't actually believe this nonsense, but it is a very powerful idea to sell to his audience of conservative, populist-oriented white people. This fear of a world in which cis, straight white people won't have the same power and privilege that they've always been used to having. And the sincerely held belief that we already live in that world, that the power you've lived your life accustomed to as a straight white person is slipping through your hands like sand, and we need to fight back now, to get it back, lest it be taken away by a singular black trans person who participated in one part of a limited run Calvin Klein photo shoot 2 years ago. But really, I think that's what all of this comes down to. The fear-mongering about Sydney Sweeney's boobs defeating wokeness, the diversity, equity, and inclusion panic, the Pride campaign backlash, the anger about certain Disney princesses being played by women of color in newer movie remakes. To me, these are all expressions of white anxiety around shifting demographics in our culture, around increasing visibility of queer people, and ultimately around losing the power that your privilege has always granted you. And there is truth to the idea that out LGBTQ people are becoming more prevalent and visible in society. And yes, the percentage of the American population that is white and Christian has been steadily declining for decades. And I don't really know what to say about that other than it just shouldn't matter to you. If you aren't racist and bigoted in all the ways that these people claim not to be, then it shouldn't matter. If you aren't clinging so tightly to the privileges that you insist don't actually exist, then who cares? But even still, the actual pace at which power is changing hands in the world that we live in is so unbelievably incremental. Like, to think that straight white people becoming an oppressed minority is something that's even within the realm of possibility in any of our lifetimes is something that only seems plausible if you spend a lot of time on Facebook, which unfortunately many people are. And yeah, this white anxiety tends to express itself in ways that are racist and homophobic and transphobic and fatphobic, but also just fucking unhinged and so detached from reality. I mean, you have people claiming that Sydney Sweeney is a civil rights icon because boobs. You have memes like this one from prolific American politics right-wing shitposter who has never been to America and lives in Malaysia, Ian Miles Chong. So in this meme, there are two panels. The top one says teachers when I was a kid, and the bottom one says teachers now. And on the top panel, it's, drawings of these three kind of trad wife looking cartoon teachers saying, I hope everyone had a good recess. Now it's time for math. And then in the teachers now one, the classroom, obviously there's a pride flag in the background, and the teacher is a drawing of a stereotype of like a non-binary person with colored hair. And they're saying, capitalism is bad and communism is good. Now let's talk about gender fluidity. And who responded to this brilliant meme? None other than Elon Musk, who wrote, "This is actually happening. Most parents don't realize it." Elon, baby boy, this is not happening. None of this is happening. You know those memes that are like, this is the future liberals want? A lot of conservatives seem to genuinely think we live in the future that liberals want. And to be clear, yes, I do wish we did. This is the future I want. And if I were Sydney Sweeney, I would dye my hair blue and buzz it and come out as non-binary just so hell would freeze over. It's what we deserve.